Hello, how y'all doing today? My name is Bernie Thompson, and today we're here to take a look at this little 2008 370Z Nissan. This little Z has a no start condition, no codes, no start. It's been to several shops, and now our job is to properly diagnose this. So the first thing I want to do is get a scan tool on and just confirm the DTCs. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay guys, I got the scan tool up. No DTCs are set. So what I want to do is I want to crank it. Reread it. So it's not setting any DTCs and the vehicle doesn't start. Now the shop already knows that if they disconnect the cam sensor on bank 1, the car will start. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and I want to unplug that cam sensor, and I want to get the car to start just so I can check the fuel control and so on. So I'm going to disconnect bank 1 cam sensor for the intake cam, and he says that this will allow it to start now. So let's go ahead and see if we can get it running. Okay, so we want to go ahead and start the car. Sure enough, just like the shop said, it would start. So it looks like we've got a fuel control problem right here. See where it's turning red? So total trim has a problem. Let's look at that. Okay, so we've got 25% fuel trim, and that's long term, and short term is 9. So we've basically got, cut off 30, 25, and 9. So that's roughly 35% trim on both banks. Now both banks are the same. Now I would estimate that if I had a cam mount, one bank would be one way and the other would be another way. But these are all the same. Okay, so I was hoping I could see if the cam might be out just by using my fuel trims. But I'm going to have a bigger problem with that. I got a lot of trim. But guys, one thing I noticed when I just unplugged the cam sensor is someone has hot rod bullshit on this car. They've changed the intake system down to the air filter and the mass air. And that can be a major problem for fuel trim. So I don't want to chase this right now. I don't think this has anything to do with unplugging the cam and having the car start or not start. Let's go back and look at the DTCs. Now, we should set a code for the DTC now because it's unplugged. So I definitely can see a code because I unplugged it. Now it's setting me that that cam is unplugged, so that's okay. And I don't want to get carried away with this fuel trim right now. And I know we can set codes for the cam sensor because we just set one. So let's take a look at this engine real quick. I want to show you what I saw when I just disconnected. Okay guys, we know we have a fuel trim issue, and it's a pretty big one, at least at idle. But this problem has something to do other than that, because I disconnected the sensor to get it to start. And I know one thing, Nissans and Infinitis, if I'm a tooth out on the timing, these cars won't start. Now usually they try to start or they start and die. This one doesn't even try to start, which is unusual. But let me show you the fuel trim problem, I think. Take a look at these tubes. Do you see this hot rod bullshit? Okay, I'm worried about these aftermarket, all this intake crap. I have fixed more fuel control problems taking this crap back off, but I know to be leery when I see fuel control problems when someone has put a bunch of crap on a car. You know, the hardest thing to fix is sabotage, right? So let's not get caught there. I need to get my scope, and I need to scope the cam and the crank sensor And to get to this crank sensor, I'm going to need a lift. So let me get a lift and get on the crank sensor, and let me get on the cam sensors and the crank, and let's try to really diagnose this car rather than getting sidetracked with some kind of fuel control issue. That's not why I'm here. I'm here to look at this car for a no start. Let's start there, okay guys? Let me get a lift. Okay guys, I got a lift and I got the car up and I got the scope connected to the crank sensor underneath. It was the easiest way I could get into the crank sensor. Let me show you where everything's connected. Okay guys, I got the crank with channel 1 underneath the car. It was the easiest place I could get into the wire. I got channel 2 red connected to the cam sensor for bank 1. I got channel 3 green connected to the cam sensor for bank 2. I've got an E-cop on the ignition coil for number 1, and I've got channel 5 in the VCT control for bank 1, because this is the one we're having problems with apparently. So now what I want to do is get some data and crank the engine over and see what we got. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to go ahead and I want to set my scope up. So I want to take channel 4, because that's where I've got that ignition, and I'm going to put 20 amp, that's a 10-time multiplier. I'm going to invert it and 0 it. Now we're set up. So now we'll come over and we'll check. So our channels are all connected, we're good there. So now I want to go ahead and I want to get the data and I want to crank it over. The car is not going to start, from what they tell me, unless I unplug bank 1 cam sensor. This car will not start. So let's just crank it over and see what the data shows us. Okay, definitely doesn't start, just like the shop says. So now is what I need to do is we need to look at some data. Okay guys, so what I want to do now is I want to zoom in on this waveform and I want to see what's actually happening. We're going to turn the crank off because I don't need it. Now right here we have a 1122, 1122. The first one right here with first drop should line up with the double drop of the cam. Let me show you how I know that. I got to put a big thank you to Ray. Ray is a tech on DN, and he is our knight in shining armor. All of us hardworking techs, when we need a cam crank, we can throw it up, and Ray somehow has them all. I can't believe this guy has that many. Thank you, Ray, for helping all the techs. This is what he gave me. So we can see that we have a 1122, 1122, 1. And do you see how that 1 lines up with the 2, and that these front edges are basically aligning pretty close? Well, that isn't what I have here. We can clearly see that that 1 isn't lining up there. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to make a measurement so I can figure out how far off it is, because that's going to make a big difference to me. So if I've got a 1122, I want to go to 11. So if I've got 1122, 11, that's 1 revolution of the cam. So let's go ahead and try this now. I'm going to zoom in on this. And what I'm interested in is right here. I want to see the difference. So we're going to get the cursors. I want to measure that leading edge to the leading edge of the red one. And basically, I'm about 15, 16 degrees off right here. So I'm a tooth off. Okay, so my rule of thumb is 15 degrees is 1 tooth. This is 1 tooth off. Now I can tell you from years of experience on Nissan and Infiniti products, if the cam is a tooth off, they usually won't start. Now usually they try to start. It fires a couple of coils and a couple of injectors until it sees the cams off, and then it shuts them off. Now this car doesn't even try to start, which is really unusual, and it also is not setting codes as we've seen. So right now I know I'm a tooth off. Now since the shop that brought this in has already pulled the cover and physically looked and inspected this and assures us that those cams are in, what I want to do is I want to move the phaser, because if the phaser got stuck, it could be it could easily be a tooth off because the phaser's off and he might not have seen that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unplug the cam sensor, I'm going to get this running, and then I'm going to control the cams with my scope. Now you guys aren't going to be able to use a scan tool to control this with, because once the computer sees the cams are off, it's not going to move them. So I want to move it to make sure that that phaser is not stuck. So let's go ahead and do that. So I've unplugged the cam sensor from bank 1 so I can start it. Now I'm in the VCT for the control of bank 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my scope to control this, because the scan tool, even if it could enable it, if the cams are out, the computer won't allow that. So now I'm going to drive this with my scope, and then I'm going to be able to check it to see if it's moving. I want to make sure that this VCT is not stuck, because it just seems like a good way that he could look at all this and not see that it's off. Okay, so let me go ahead and start this up and then we'll get the data. Okay, so now I'm going to plug bank 1 back in. So now we're back in and we've got a bank 1 and bank 2 and it's running. Now is what I want to do. So I want to come over here to stack scope. So here we've got the 2 waveforms and I'm triggering on it so I can stabilize it. Then we can see that that isn't lining up with this, and that's where it should be. So what I want to do now is I want to come over here to outputs, and I've set it up for 6 seconds, so it'll turn on for 6 seconds, and I'm going to drive it at a 50% duty cycle. So watch the red one. Do you see how it's moving? See how it's moving? Okay, guys. So watch the red one. Do you see how it's moving? See how it's moving? Okay, guys. The cam phaser is not stuck. Let me do that one more time. I'm going to go ahead and start this. We're going to go over here. Okay, watch this. It's going to move. Do you see how it's advancing? It's moving to the left. Anything that moves to the left on the scope is advancing. Anything that moves to the right is retarded. R and R. If it moves to the right, it's retarded or it's late. Then we can see that this actually could move when I commanded it. So we're definitely able to move this cam. So the phaser is not stuck. So that's for sure. The phaser is not stuck. So now is what I want to do is I need to get in a cylinder, and I need an in-cylinder pressure waveform so I can figure out what's going on with this car. You get the spark plug out here for bank 1, sensor, or cylinder 1, bank 1, cylinder 1. This is a 12mm plug, so I'm going to use the adapter here. We're going to get a pressure transducer into this one right here. Okay guys, I've got the scope set up. Let me show you how we've got our traces set up. Okay, now I've got a 300-pound pressure transducer in cylinder 1, and I got a 300-pound pressure transducer in cylinder 2. So that's bank 1 and bank 2. And I've got a vacuum pressure transducer into the vacuum port. Let me show you where those are plugged in. The ATS scope powers these pressure transducers right from the scope. So channel 2 in red is bank 1. Channel 3 in green is bank 2, and channel 4 blue is my intake poles. So that's the pressures hooked up. The yellow trace is still connected to the crank, and now the cam sensor for bank 1 is on channel 7 orange, and the cam sensor for bank 2 is in purple. And the channel 5 white is connected to the VCT to make sure it's not driving. And then I've got channel 7 or 8 brown connected to the number 1 ignition coil. So that's how we're set up. Let's go ahead and get some waveforms and see what's going on with this car. So I set the scope up, I set channel 2, 3, and 4 up for the pressure transducers, and then I zeroed them. So we're all ready to go. So I want to go ahead and start the data. Now I want to crank it and get the data so we can analyze it to see what's going on with this little Z. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to look down here and I just want to make sure the cams are still off. Let's turn the crank off. So right here, we can see where the single fall is not. Here's my double and the single. That edge should be falling on this edge. This edge should fall on this edge. That's off. So right now, the cam is off. For sure, the cams are off. The next thing I want to do is I want to come down here and I can see that this is the VCT control is not being applied on. So the VCT is not being applied. So that's not part of what our problem is. So right now is what I want to do is I want to go in and we want to look at the compression waveforms and analyze these compression waveforms. So I'm going to turn bank 2 off and we're going to just look at bank 1 to start with. Okay, we're going to put a cursor through each one and then we're going to mark this. And now we're going to come in and we're going to look at this. Now I want to go ahead and I want to clean the data up on the pressure waveforms so they're a little bit easier to read. Okay, so I can see the exhaust cam. That's bottom dead center, 30-60. Bottom dead 60, that's where I expect that to fall. But what I'm interested in is the intake, because the target wheel is on the intake because that's the phased cam. Now notice that this little V right here, that's when the valve opened, and it's got a little bit of a late opening, so when the valve opens I've already got the piston moving down and it makes this little V. But that's right at the 30 mark. And so watch this, we'll zoom in over here. Okay, so now this, let's remark this. We're going to come down just a little bit where we get a better mark. Okay, now we can see that that V is right at the 30, and we can see that this rise right here was at the 30 as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the cursor. Do you see how I came across flat and right there it started to rise? So that valve opened at 30. And right here, the valve opened at 30, the valve closes at 30, right there. So that's normal. Now I want to do one more thing when we're here, and that is to look at this waveform right here. Pick the firing order. Okay, so this is my intake pull, each one, and the intake pulls now are marked. Okay, now if we look at this, these are all even. Now if one of the cams was out, every other one, because the firing order and the cams on this, it goes from 1, 2, 3, and it's going from bank to bank on the firing order. Every other one would be low if that was true, if that cam was out. And that cam, these are all real even, guys. I don't see that as being my problem. So now is what I want to do is I want to go look at the other bank here. So we just looked at that at 1. Let's look at bank 2 now. Okay, so my exhaust pocket is at 60. That's where I expect it. But once again, I'm not worried about the exhaust cam. This is the intake cam. But notice the V is right in the same place, just right about the 30-degree mark. And notice my rise here. So that's top dead center. That's 30 degrees. Right at 30 degrees, I start to rise right there. So the valve closes at 30 degrees and it opens right at 30. These two cams are identical, guys. But let's look at something else now. Let's turn on these. So this is my two cam targets. Now we got with the time, so we can turn the time into degrees here really easily. And now we have a good mark from peak to peak, better than I had before. Okay, so now from that edge to that edge, I'm 17 degrees. I'm a tooth off, and that is a tooth off. Right now, that's a tooth off, guys. So if that's a tooth off right now, but the two cams are right on, the cams would have to be off 17 degrees, 16 degrees, but the cams are on within a degree or two. So that tells me that both the cams are right, and if both cams are in the exact same position and the phaser can move, we've already seen that the target wheel has moved on the phaser. So this is going to need a new phaser because the target wheel is the only thing that could have moved. If the whole phaser moved, the cam would be out of time too, but the cam is in time, so that's not what happened. That's the advantage of using pressure transducers, guys. These pressure transducers are just an amazing technology. So now I know both cams are in the same exact position during crank while the cam sensors show that I'm off a tooth. The two waveforms from the pressure in the cylinder are the same. That means that the cams are in the same position in both heads. The only way that you could have this problem is if the cam phaser, the target wheel on that phaser moved. This is a target wheel problem, not a cam problem. So we're going to need to pull it back apart. And this goes to another shop. So this is going back to another shop to get torn apart. This shop won't get this work. He's just diagnosing it. But the phaser definitely has to be the problem. And someone might say, oh yeah, the sensors could maybe do this. But I've never seen a magnetized cam or sensor make a whole tooth off. But this has brand new, both cam sensors are new Nissan sensors, and the crank sensor is a new crank sensor. That's what I guess he got online, and online they said to replace all of the sensors if you have this problem. So he replaced all the sensors, he tore the cover off, he's already physically inspected it, and he still has this problem. But this isn't that type of a problem. What's wrong is we can clearly see what the problem is following the data. The number one target wheel has moved on the phaser. It's not in the same place. So this is going to need the target wheel fixed on the number one bank. Guys, is that one crazy little Z or what? This car is insane. Cam sensor, crank sensor, all new. Whole front cover removed and everything inspected and put back together, and it still has the problem. What do you do with a car like this? How are you going to fix it? If you don't use scopes, you're probably not going to diagnose this car correctly. You're going to have a real fight on your hand. You know, God, can you imagine putting all these parts on here and it didn't fix it? That's a double rut row day, guys. We don't want to have double rut row days. Get a scope, learn how to use it. You'll stop having double rut row days and you'll start being successful. Use a scope in your bays and you too will be successful diagnosing hard cars. Okay guys, we're back over here at the 370Z, and they've torn it apart. And as you can see, this is a major undertaking to get into this front cover. I mean, the shop that brought this in has had this cover off several times, and they've lined up everything, and they told us absolutely everything was lined up, that there's no problem under the cover. But now let me show you what's really going on. Okay guys, this is the old phaser and this is the dot. Now look at where the target wheel is. That's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 4 teeth over. And the new one right here from the dot, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This target right here is 1 tooth further over than this one. This target wheel on the old one is in a different place. Now both of these part numbers, I have two different part numbers. Now this one came from Nissan for this car, so we know it's right. And I can see the target is 1 tooth off, and that's what we found on the scope. It was going to be 1 tooth, and clearly it's 1 tooth because we can count them, and this old one is 4 and the new one is 5. That's 1 tooth off. Okay guys, here's these two phasers. If you look right here, that target is almost right through the bolt. If you look at that one, you can clearly see that that target wheel is in a different place on the phaser. But guys, if I don't have both these target wheels right here, that's going to be a tough ask for anyone to see that that's off that much. And would you ever be thinking that that target could be moved from the phaser? Wow. Okay guys, can you blame that shop? There's no way. I'm looking at this thing all put together with the chains on, and I can't see that that's off. The only reason that I know that's off is because I knew it before I pulled it apart what I was looking for. Can you imagine that it just won't start? So you line all the marks on the chains up and everything's aligned. You're not looking for the target wheel to have moved on a phaser. Wow, really? If you don't do the diagnosis up front, you could be like this shop and tear it down twice, have all that time that you just flushed that diagnostic money right down the toilet. Get a scope, be accurate, learn how to follow data, and you too can make one of these kind of diagnoses, because this is a next level diagnosis on this little 370Z, as you can see.